So while my presentation is coming up, I should say I played very much a walk-on part in the core project, and so I can, without fear of self-congratulation, issue genuine congratulations to Wendy and to Sam Bowles in particular, who have put such energy and dedication into this project to a point where I think it is going to have, and I'm sure it's going to have, a transformational effect on economics teaching. Just in terms of my own personal connection to core, I feel myself more as a core groupie than a core insider. And I particularly was challenged because last year, having had a period of not much engagement with undergraduate teaching, I was asked by the LSE to teach the main second year intermediate micro course to 750 students. And I searched the textbooks, and apologies to anyone in the room who's written one of those textbooks, and it became very clear to me early on, partly because I've been so influenced by Wendy, that I couldn't possibly use any of the textbooks to teach second year microeconomics. So I'm kind of grappling in a very practical sense with how we teach second year micro in the spirit of core. But today I am going to talk about the core materials, and I'm going to talk about a specific issue of tackling climate change. Sadly, only in the classroom. I'm not going to have so much to say about how we tackle it in reality, although hopefully if we give people a better understanding of the economic issues, we have a chance of tackling it in practice. And I'm going to use that both to illustrate to you some of the merits of core, and I'll show you some graphics coming out of the various core materials that Wendy mentioned. But I'll also talk about some of the, I think, ongoing challenges, particularly for those of us who are, say, teaching second year intermediate micro, and how we do this, and I'm still working on it. But let me show you first of all something that asks about the demand side. So I'm going to talk mainly about the supply side, what we do, but what about the demand side for students? I did, this is something I learned from Wendy, and I asked our undergraduate coordinator this year to ask our students, our second and third year students, not actually our first year students. I missed the boat on the first year students, I was too late in asking that. I said, will you please ask the students the question that Wendy has been asking for a long time: what do you think are the most important questions that economists should be working on? And Dimitra kindly produced a word cloud from that. And this was the second year students, the one I'm going to be teaching next term. Two things really strike you on that. Inequality is there, so absolutely in line with what Wendy was saying, but also climate change. And it's not surprising for those of you who've been following what's going on in London. Around the time that this question was asked about students, we had this big protest by a movement called Extinction Rebellion that was trying to cause a lot of interest and concern in climate change issues. And clearly our students thought, well, one of the things I want to learn by doing economics is why these people are taking to the streets and what economics has to say about tackling climate change. And then I realized, I looked at typical textbooks, second year textbooks, and of course they teach public goods and externalities and all the usual stuff that we believe is the foundation of thinking about that. But almost not at all do they really engage with what are the central issues in climate change. And I'll mention what I mean by that in a moment. And very much I want to bring this into the course that I'm teaching for second years. And who knows where that will lead, but that's where it is at the minute. Of course, so as I say, the standard economic approach is not entirely innocent of the kinds of issues that lie behind this. We teach externalities. We teach that Pigouvian taxes can play a role in coping with externalities. We talk about regulations. When do we need regulations versus taxes? We probably teach something about the Coase theorem, the limits on private solutions to dealing with externalities. And we discuss the value of some market-based options, such as using tradable permits to try and have a more efficient way of dealing with these issues. So we do teach these things. They are part of the curriculum. Rarely do, I think, perhaps more and more, the climate change is used as a kind of motivating example. But I don't think I would say it's kind of taught as a somewhat dry topic. And when I was taught it was about beekeepers pollinating the flowers of an adjacent farmer or something. And, it's all well and good, but I hardly think it really, for most students, it would get them sitting on the edge of their chair. So I'd say, though, that the approach we take more or less has three main flaws. First of all, it's very static, and I think that's a real limitation when we come to think about that problem. It doesn't consider politics. So a theme that runs, in fact, the part of the core project I was directly involved in was the Unit 21, which is trying to introduce students to political economy. But I think politics is absolutely central. Political economy has to be front and center. And I think that links back to why were these people on the street? They're on the street because they don't think government is adequately dealing with these issues. So we need to think about what gives governments incentives to respond to these, what could be the mother of all externalities. And it considers a very limited range of dynamics, even when it considers dynamics. Okay, so let me just sort of talk you through some of the tools in the core toolkit that already exist to illuminate this, and then kind of wrap up, so I'll be quite brief. So the dynamics, so this is a kind of picture, this comes from the Economics, Society and Public Policy version of core. So it has a long section on the environment, and this is a typical thing we might show students who are concerned about climate change. This is the Northern Hemisphere temperatures over the long run, and show that since 1900 we've had this very sharp increase in temperatures. This is kind of to illustrate to them that, first of all, this is an issue that's got much more severe in the 20th century. You can show more scary stuff than this. You can look at some of the forward-looking projections if you want from some of the science, and they look really very, very striking, and if you take them seriously, very concerning. Here's the link to carbon emissions as the source of this, and obviously then you can begin to get into the question of what would it take to mitigate carbon emissions, what are the kinds of strategies, and come back to some of this more traditional material, taxation, regulation, and so forth. And as you can see, the atmospheric stock of carbon has gone up since 1900. Now, of course, we know that correlation and causation are not necessarily proof of anything, but strikingly in the period in which we saw those increases in temperature and also carbon emissions. So it's a good way, and again, this comes from the core material, so there's some real good material in there you can pull down and use with students to motivate them to think about these issues. Here's a different graphic from our World in Data, which, by the way, I know we're not here to plug that, but that's a wonderful resource for people teaching economics. You can pull down information and very quickly turn it into graphics and put it in front of students to illustrate concepts in economics and bring to life things that otherwise are just taught in a very dry way. And it's a very flexible tool. You can change time periods, country samples, all sorts of things. Create a graphic, snip it, and stick it straight into a slide. And it makes teaching economics a joy to be able to have access to that. So anyone who hasn't discovered the joys of our world in data, I strongly recommend you to find it. But this shows the sort of the link with GDP per capita and some of the cross-country issues. And of course, you can talk, if you show this kind of thing to students, about some of the challenges that link to development challenges. As we hope some of these countries grow, then that's going to potentially lead to an even larger carbon emissions problem. It also allows you to look at where some of the really high emissions are coming from, particularly in the Middle East. Okay, so this is a way, when I teach this stuff now, I very much begin with this kind of background empirical material so that the students can immediately see that what they're about to think about when they're thinking about taxing and externality is both global and majorly important potentially to the future of the human race. When most of the people who are going to be affected by this are not yet even born. So we want current governments to deal with that. So that naturally leads into a discussion about discounting. How do you discount the welfare of current generations versus future generations? And there's a wonderful tool in the core materials, which I referenced down there, which allows you to play around with thinking about discounting and the implications of discounting. And I introduced the debate that took place between Nick Stern on the one hand, who argued for very low discounting in the Stern Review, versus the more conventional economics view, is you should discount the environment much in the same way as you discount in using numbers from financial markets and so forth. And you can get into that discussion. And the core tools are wonderful in giving you a way of getting the students to go out there and they can play around with numbers and think about the implications. And I think, I mean, there's a behavioral economics literature on this, as you know. Kind of compound interest is extremely counterintuitive. So you begin to realize yourself, let alone for the students, just how sensitive many calculations become because of compounding to the kinds of decisions we make today. The other issue you can raise with students in discussion of this is the possibility of unstable dynamics. And there's, again, a wonderful tool in the economy which allows students to think about how sea ice melting at T+1 is related to the melting of sea ice at T, and how you can get a kind of unstable equilibrium emerging. This won't be up to go into more detail. This is actually a wonderful moving graphic. You can click on it multiple times and see the curves. By the way, there's a wonderful article, I don't know if I mentioned this to Wendy, by Nicholas Caldor in the 1930s on business cycles, which has a picture that looks rather like this. And he tried to explain the theory of business cycles by the movement of curves that would lead to catastrophic faults. So this has a lovely project. So there's lots of issues you can raise with students when you get into this, and often they're really dynamic issues. And so you get students thinking about dynamic economics, not just about static equilibrium, which I think is one of the problems with the way we teach economics. We teach it in such a static way, and I don't think when you're thinking about these issues you can do that. And one issue I take up with them is the dynamics of technology. And the big question is, can this be left to the market? Well, this is the left-hand graphic, I should say, is again from the core materials and about the falling cost of renewables. And I can tell stories about this because I sit on the government's National Infrastructure Commission in the UK, and it's just remarkable how all targets on implementing, using renewables for energy, for particularly electricity generation, have exceeded all targets that the government ever set, and that's because there have been these phenomenal improvements in technology that have allowed us to take advantage of this. But the right-hand thing is something I snipped from an article by Philippe Aghion, Doran Asimoglu, and a number of colleagues, David Hamus, where they've done this wonderful paper. So this is where you can actually bring in some research, and I always enjoy in my classroom actually bringing a real research paper. This is an unpublished paper, and it's a paper about the consequences of shale gas for technological change. So it turned out around 2010 in the US, shale gas revolution came, and that meant that the cost of fossil fuels fell dramatically in the US. And they argued this actually altered the incentives for technological change. So around 2010, you see quite a dramatic fall in patenting for renewable energy. So effectively, you have this dynamic effect coming from this process, and students can get quite into the idea of, you've changed the relative price now, you've made fossil fuels cheaper, so people who are thinking about where to innovate are much less likely to innovate in renewables and alternatives. They actually innovate in the context of the stuff that supports fossil fuels. So you've actually had technological change which goes contrary to the goal of reducing carbon emissions ultimately. Okay. Finally, I take up a lot of, again, partly personal preference, but students hear a lot about political economy in my second year course. And the question is, does anyone care about all of this? Well, you see people on the streets, so somebody cares. And there's a couple of graphics, data from the World Values Survey, about how far people are, first of all, they rate environment as a problem. I'll tell you what's on the axes here in a moment. Or they think that there should be higher taxes paid for the environment. And the one thing you show them is the very strong pattern, generational pattern. And this is a much bigger issue among younger people than among older people. And you can start to joke about discount rates in a sort of rather macabre sense of the term and think about that. But actually it does seem like this is something that that's really an issue that the young are much more fired up than the old. It's not therefore surprising that our students, who are in my case certainly a lot younger than I am, are much more concerned about this than the people who are teaching them. And we have to, I think, signal we're in touch with the kinds of things they worry about. The other is to see how it varies with education. But the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be concerned about this. So knowledge is really important, I think, in firing people up. And you then can begin to think, are there ways of escaping what I like to call the political economy trap of climate change, namely that we only have current governments represented. Can international treaties substitute for standard politics? Can you find ways to get governments to commit future policy, particularly if you think endogenous technological change is important? How do you persuade people that electric cars are going to happen? Are there commitment technologies that you can introduce into politics to make that credible? How does change happen? Well, this says it all, doesn't it? The final thing, this is a theme some of you heard any of my talks here will know this is the theme I care about. How do we change people's values and culture? Sam Bowles, of course, has been on the case for a long time, and he's one of the key partners in CORE. So I don't know the CORE is yet doing a lot on this, but I actually feel very strongly that in the case of an issue like climate change, unless you're going to change people's instinctive behaviour and their values, our odds of solving this problem are quite limited. So I guess all I've been trying to say is that climate change is sort of an opportunity, in fact. I know that sounds the wrong way, but it's an opportunity for us to teach economics, I think, can really make the subject appeal to students, to show them that we have the tools to look at this. But we can only do that if we're going to be bolder than we would be if we stuck to anything close to the textbooks. Now maybe there'll be a version of the economy. Wendy and Sam have such grand ambitions, I don't know where they are in intermediate micro, but intermediate micro is crying out for a new approach, just as the areas that have already been tackled. And you've got to think dynamically, you've got to think about political economy, you've got to think about preferences and values. And then just finally, a little cartoon that I like, where this guy's at the climate change summit, and he says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing?